Super. I'm excited to be here. How many of you were in my morning class? Enjoyed the morning class? Good stuff. All right, we're going to hear a little bit, just a little bit of some of the things repeated. But what I want to do is I want to promise you I'm not going to teach you. I'm an attorney, but I'm not going to teach you about the Supreme Court. Because I teach the Constitution, and the Supreme Court hasn't been concerned about the Constitution for quite some time. If you ever endeavor to go to law school, the first thing you need to understand is that they don't teach the Constitution in law school.
Right.
They teach constitutional law, which is totally different. Constitutional law teaches that judges and lawyers know more about the Constitution than the men who wrote it. Which is why the Supreme Court has been acting unconstitutionally since, well, they started down that road in 1803. When in a decision called Marbury versus Madison, they claimed themselves to be the ultimate rulers of the universe. Would you like to be part of that group? Now what I do when I travel is I teach the truth in history that has not been taught for quite some time, so I want to go ahead and warn you from the get-go. Some things that you hear from me today are the truth, but they will go contrary to what you're taught in school. Yes, ma'am?
Don't disagree.
Oh.
This is the amen.
That's the amen.
Oh, that's the amen corner? All right, okay, all right. Awesome, gotcha. I'm going to warn the adults, what you are about to hear today may challenge some things that you've thought to be true your entire life. But I've done a study on the educational system directed by a woman named Charlotte Iserbyt, and I've seen some stuff from her over there on the table, so if you want to know about the American education system, there's no better teacher than Charlotte Iserbyt. But the Marxist takeover of our education system began around 1885. No, not 1985. 1885. And so our education system has been infiltrated by people who want to change who we are for quite some time. And so I want to bring the truth to you. 265 times in 22 states I taught last year. Now, let me go ahead and just get this out of the way because I'm terrible at this part of the presentation. I just want you to know, because I know there are people from all over here. I teach like this all over the country. I don't charge any speaking fees. I have no speaking fees. I don't require any group to compensate me for travel or accommodation. This is a ministry for me. And so if you have a group, a school, a homeschool co-op, a group of any kind that you want to learn the history that I teach, and I teach a whole bunch of different lessons. A church, I travel around the country and I teach religious liberty, the truth in religious liberty across the country. It's not going to cost you a dime to ask me to come and teach. All you have to do is contact me through my website and we will get you scheduled. Now it may take a little while, being that I speak for free. I keep a pretty busy schedule. So what do you say? Let's get started. Patrick Henry said, "I have but one lamp by which my feet are guided, and that is the lamp of experience. I know no way to judge the future but by the past." Alexander Hamilton said, "Experience is the oracle of truth, and where its responses are unequivocal, they ought to be held to be sacred and conclusive." What Patrick Henry is telling us is, I don't need to have a psychic to know your future. All I have to do is study my past. Alexander Hamilton is just simply telling us that if it happens the same way over and over and over again, it's likely going to happen the same way over and over and over again. Are we guaranteed that the sun will rise tomorrow morning?
Yeah. Not necessarily.
No, we're not. We have absolutely no guarantee that the sun will rise tomorrow morning. But because the sun has risen every morning, every day of our life, and every morning, every day of our parents' life, and every morning of every day of every life since the beginning of this earth, we can be pretty much guaranteed that the sun will rise again tomorrow. That's what Alexander Hamilton is saying. There are things that you can rely on based on experience. But that fundamental understanding, that principle of truth, is being undermined in our society today. We are being taught that the Constitution is a living, breathing document, that our framers were intellectually inferior to us, and because they were too stupid to know what they meant when they wrote the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and the Declaration of Independence, we, in our intellectual superiority, have to go back and tell them what they really meant.
Right.
That's what they mean by a living, breathing document. Not simply amending the Constitution through proper amendment procedure, but redefining the terms. For instance, the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Modern scholars, and I'll put those little quotation marks there because they're only brilliant in their own minds, want us to believe that our framers wrote that Second Amendment so that we could hunt, go skeet shooting, collect guns, or protect ourselves from criminals. But you see, a well-regulated militia, they say, must be the military or a force at the command of Congress. Because after all, our framers called it a well-regulated militia, and everybody knows that nobody regulates as well as the government. So it must have meant government militia, right? Only that's not what well-regulated means. I believe we must be the only culture in the world that believes if you look up in the dictionary the word to regulate, it's synonymous the same as to govern. That's not it. To our framers, well-regulated meant this. See this motion that I'm doing? It's the same motion, over and over again, without deviation, like a factory worker who does the same function over and over and over again. Well-regulated means you've been trained to do something in the same way over and over and over again without deviation. It has nothing to do with the government. Our framers believed that they had to secure the right to keep and bear arms, not for hunting. They were not afraid that the deer and the rabbits would organize to disarm us. Not for skeet shooting. They did not believe that the hunters of the world, or that the sportsmen of the world would unite and keep everybody who wasn't a sportsman from shooting guns. And when they had secured our right to keep and bear arms, although there was an application for personal protection, that was not the purpose. They were not afraid that criminals would organize in a racket to disarm local and lawful citizens. Unless, of course, you consider the Department of Justice an organized criminal group, which I do.
Preach it, sister.
You see, Noah Webster said, before the standing army can rule, the people must be disarmed as they are in every kingdom in Europe.
Right.
The supreme power in America, he said, cannot enforce unjust and unconstitutional laws by the sword because the whole body of the people are armed and constitute a force superior to any band of regular troops that can be created by the government. He said a force at the command of Congress can institute no law, but the people find just and constitutional, for the people will possess the power. And jealousy will instantly inspire them to resist any law they find to be unconstitutional and oppressive. Richard Henry Lee said, "It is essential to the preservation of liberty that the whole body of the people always possess arms." And here's the well-regulated part. "And teach their children at a young age how to use them." Parents, if we are not training our children how to keep and bear arms, we are not preserving liberty. Richard Henry Lee said it's essential to the preservation of liberty that we always possess arms. Let me ask you, young people, if something is essential, can you do without it?
Nope.
If you're always doing something, is there ever a moment when you're not doing it? Of course not, because then it wouldn't be always. Richard Henry Lee said, if you're not packing, you're not preserving. And if you're not training your children how to keep and bear arms, then you're training up a generation of servants and slaves. But this is how revisionism works. Our Attorney General, Eric Holder, gave a presentation that said, we need to brainwash the people to think differently about guns. Is that something you would want your government to say to you? We need to brainwash you to make you think differently about guns. That's this whole living, breathing thing. We have to understand that our framers didn't invent anything. Thomas Jefferson did not invent liberty when he wrote the Declaration of Independence. As a matter of fact, by the time we leave here this morning, you'll understand that Thomas Jefferson didn't even write the Declaration of Independence as much as he plagiarized it from 5 other documents. Our Constitution, our Bill of Rights, there is nothing original in them. We inherited everything. Not because our framers were psychics. They didn't go and see a psychic medium. They didn't have a crystal ball. And they didn't even have a burning bush experience with God. They had a wisdom and an understanding that all they had to do was look at history so they knew what we would see in the future, and they gave us a protection. Problem is, if we don't know what our rights are, who's going to protect them? How about I give you a pop quiz? Are you ready for your pop quiz? You guys didn't know you were going to have a pop quiz? All right, here's the conditions of the pop quiz. You cannot answer out loud. You cannot mumble the answer. You cannot even lip sync the answer. I don't want your neighbor to know whether you know the answer. I want your neighbor to know whether he knows the answer. Okay? So keep this to yourself. Now this is a bright group. I bet I'm going to have better statistics here than I would in most of the groups that I teach. But here we go. There are 5 individual liberties identified in the First Amendment alone. To yourself and not out loud, name all 5. We have a Supreme Court justice in Florida who took a poll and asked that question. Found out of the people polled, only 2% of the people asked could name all 5. 2 out of every 100 people could name all 5. Which means I'm pretty sure there are some people in this room who can only name 4. And I'm pretty sure there's some people in this room who can only name 3. Now where you fall in that statistic is your business. That's why I didn't ask you to answer out loud. But I asked you that question just so I could ask you this one. If you do not know what your rights are, how do you know they're not already gone? Do you know the Constitution does not protect your rights? The Constitution cannot protect your rights. You do not have constitutionally established rights, and you do not have constitutionally protected rights. The Constitution is a piece of paper with ink on it. Can the Constitution pick up a red pen and write your representative a letter? Can the Constitution go sit in your senator's office and demand compliance? Can the Constitution pick up a sword and alter or abolish? So when Jefferson points out very accurately that sometimes there are times to do that. No, it cannot, because the Constitution cannot protect your rights. The only protector of your liberty is sitting in your seats right now, and if you don't know what your liberty is, then you don't have it. That's why this camp is important.
Yes.
Not for yourself. And I know this is hard to think of right now. Not just for yourself, but for your children and your grandchildren. John Adams said, liberty must be supported at all hazards. Liberty. Not security. Not prosperity. Liberty. Liberty must be supported at all hazards. He says we have a right to it derived from our Maker. How many of you have heard of a principle called natural law? Have you heard of a guy named John Locke? How many of you have read the treatise of John Locke? The complete treatise. You're looking around to see who's actually the big enough nerd to read the complete treatise of John Locke, right?
That nerd would be at the front of the class.
Hey, I'm a proud nerd, okay? I get excited about reading Mercy Otis Warren. Shakespearean style. Anyway, if I had asked that question in 1776, the people in this room would have been looking around for those who did not raise their hand. Because that was common knowledge. Raise your hand if you've at least heard of the Treatise of Montesquieu. Algernon. These were common readings. Most of our children were homeschooled. And that was part of their daily lessons. So reading the Federalist Papers and the Anti-Federalist Papers were not difficult because they had a foundational understanding that we don't have. They understood where their liberty came from. John Adams said, "We have a right to it derived from our Maker." He was expressing this natural law. Natural law teaches that we are created in the image of God. And because we're created in the image of God, we've inherited certain things from God. One thing that we've inherited from God is freedom. God is the most ultimate free being in the universe. Raise your hand if it's your job to wake up every day and tell God how to run things. I can tell you I try sometime, but the older that I get, the more grateful I am that God rarely listens to what I want. But you see, we've inherited that freedom. Not the wisdom and not the power, but the freedom. Problem is, we don't understand what liberty is. We don't understand what freedom is. We don't want a country built on freedom. That's hard to hear because we've been hearing that a lot. We don't want to live in a country built on freedom. Do you know why? If we are built on freedom alone, that means we're free to lie. We're free to steal. We're free to murder. We are free to do whatever we want to do regardless of how that affects anyone else. Does that sound like a nice place to live? Because freedom all by itself is anarchy. Freedom and liberty are not the same thing. Liberty is freedom plus morality.
Amen. Amen.
That shared morality that says, yes, I realize I am free to lie, I'm free to steal, and I'm free to murder, but I will not because it's wrong. To my future leaders and to my parents of future leaders and grandparents of future leaders, let me tell you something that makes your legislators unhappy. Laws don't stop crimes.
Right.
We need to really, really understand that. Laws do not stop crimes. As an attorney, I spent nearly a decade over a decade in the criminal justice system, and I can assure you, the criminal justice system was not designed to stop crimes.
Right.
The criminal justice system was designed to identify criminal activity and set up a way to punish criminals. There are only two things that will stop a man from murdering his neighbor. Just two. You are free to murder your neighbor anytime you want to. Do you realize that?
Amen.
You are free to murder your neighbor anytime you want to. Now, you will suffer the consequences for doing that, but you are free to murder your neighbor anytime you want to, and there are only two things to stop you. I am free to murder my neighbor, but I will not because it's wrong. Morality.
Morality.
I am free to murder my neighbor, but I will not because he's well armed.
Come on.
Force. There are only two things that will stop criminal activity: morality and force. But the more immoral a society becomes, the more force must be applied to keep order. And when we as a people become so immoral that we no longer govern ourselves, we look to the government to keep us safe, and the government says, we're more than happy to do that because we have to apply force. Because the government cannot dictate morality, the government cannot force morality, the government can only force force. And the more force the government has to apply, the more power you must give them to do that. And the more power the government has, the less liberty you have.
Come on.
That's why liberty must be supported at all hazards. You must be a moral people.
Yes.
That's why John Adams, when speaking to battalion commanders in Massachusetts, said that our Constitution is for a moral and religious people alone. It is wholly inadequate for any other.
No.
Notice he didn't say religious only, because religion will destroy you as well.
Amen.
But a moral and religious people alone. What he was teaching those commanders was, look, the power that we have vested in you through this Constitution, if you are not a moral people, he said, you will destroy this Constitution like a whale through a net. Liberty must be supported at all hazards. You have a right to it derived from our Maker, he says, but if we had not. John Adams is writing a dissertation on feudal and canon law in 1765, and I believe maybe he thought, maybe I'm not just teaching Christians. Maybe I'm teaching some people who don't know natural law. Maybe I'm teaching some people who don't believe natural law. So, here you go. Even if God had not given us liberty, you cannot deny, he says, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Liberty may be a gift from God, but I'm here to tell you it comes at a price. Liberty is gifted to you, but you have to pay to maintain it and keep it and secure it for future generations. There's a man named John Philpott Curran who was speaking at a governor's race in Dublin, Ireland in 1790. He said, it is the common fate of the indolent. Indolent means lazy, inactive. It is the common fate of the lazy to see their liberty stolen by the active. The condition upon which God grants liberty to man is eternal vigilance. And if that condition be broken, servitude is his punishment and the immediate indication of his guilt. If you are eternally vigilant, you are not a couch potato for liberty.
Right.
It means you must be active in your defense of liberty. And if we can go back a little bit, remember, if you do not know what your liberty is, how are you going to actively defend it? Now, our framers did not invent anything in our Constitution or our Bill of Rights. As a matter of fact, our framers inherited everything just like we did. There are some things that we need to understand, some things that we are taught wrong, and it's the little foxes that spoil the vine, the little lies. How many of you have ever seen those men on the side of the road with the look like telescopes, and they're called surveyors, right? And if you're building a road, you have to project way off into the distance where your road is going to be, and you have to project it with such a degree of accuracy. If you're going to lay Interstate 10, which runs from one coast to the other, and you are off in Florida by this much, you're going to be way off by the time you get to Arizona. Okay? It's the little deviations. Let me go ahead and lay some framework here. The Revolutionary War was not fought between the Americans and the British. There were no Americans in the Revolutionary War, not yet. They were British citizens, British subjects, fighting their government who had denied them liberty that was guaranteed through their liberty charters. This was not a foreign war, this was a civil war. And there's a big difference there, because men may go to foreign wars for light and transient reasons, oil, money, whatever, but they will not go to civil war unless it's a really, really big deal. The other thing we need to understand is everyone who lived in the colonies was subject to the Crown of Great Britain. It did not matter where you came from. The minute you stepped foot in the colonies, you were subject to British law, and if you made your home there, you became a subject of the Crown of Great Britain. Because some people are going to tell you, oh, well, British history is irrelevant to who we are because we are the melting pot, we came from all over. Now, that's true. Even Thomas Paine in Common Sense remarks that the advantage that our framers had was because they were not all British, but we came from everywhere. But you see, there's a principle of law that you have to understand. If you leave New Hampshire and you go to Massachusetts, and a police officer pulls you over for breaking Massachusetts law, can you look at the police officer and say, no, wait a minute, I live in New Hampshire, so I'm just following New Hampshire law? Don't you have to follow Massachusetts law when you're in Massachusetts? What if you leave New Hampshire? Now, and I know not all of you are from New Hampshire, but if you sell your home in New Hampshire and you go buy a home in Massachusetts, are you still a resident of the state of New Hampshire? No, you are now a resident of Massachusetts. So no matter where you came from around the globe, the minute you stepped foot in the British colonies, you had to follow British law, and if you bought your home there, you are now a British subject. That's why this is important. Because we declared independence from Great Britain, not from Holland and Spain and from wherever. And it was the British Liberty Charters that established a fundamental foundation for liberty that we simply expanded upon. Now, understanding that we were all subjects to the Crown of Great Britain means that our form of government in 1775 was a kingdom. Now, there's some things that we need to understand about kingdoms. When you live in a kingdom, the king rules, right? The subjects of a king have no rights, no privileges, unless the king says so. And that can change from day to day. Are kings elected? Of course not. Kings are on the throne by a principle called divine right. Divine right says God makes kings. The only way you get to be king is if you're born in the right family and in the right birth order. See, even if you're born in the right family and you're the fourth born of 4 sons, you don't get to be king unless you kill off 3 brothers. You know that happens, right?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So when you live in a kingdom and you're the subject to a king, you literally wake up every single day wondering what's right and what's wrong, because the king can change the laws just like that. Whatever. Yesterday it was okay. Today it's not, because the king's in a bad mood. We are not a kingdom. We are a constitutional republic. Now, when I travel around and I teach in the schools, what do you suppose the most popular answer is when I ask people what kind of government we are? Democracy. But you see, that's our fault, parents. That's not the fault of your education system. Because I believe as parents and grandparents, if we understood what a democracy was, we wouldn't simply roll our eyes and shake our heads at when our teachers are teaching our children that we're democracies, or our conservative talking heads call us a democracy, because I've watched them and heard them say that. You see, here's how this works. Let's build a political spectrum. Are you ready? Kingdom, all the way over here. You have no rights, no privileges unless the king says so. And then I cannot read that paper, so are you sending me a sign? Okay. Sorry, I can't read that. I have a clock up here, so thank you. Distraction. Okay, kingdom over here. No rights, no privileges unless the king says so. Constitutional republic. Completely opposite to a kingdom. You can't get any more opposite to a kingdom than a constitutional republic. Because in a kingdom, the king holds all the rights and the privileges, and the people have nothing unless the king says so. In a constitutional republic, the people hold all the rights and the power, and they delegate power to the government as they see fit. Right? Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So where does a democracy fit in that spectrum? Is it closer to a republic? Is it somewhere in the middle? The truth of the matter is, there is no difference between a democracy and a kingdom. The only difference between a democracy and a kingdom is how many people rule over you. In a kingdom, it's just one guy, obviously, practically his court, but in a monarchy, it's one guy. In a democracy, it's mob rule. A mob rules over you, which means you have no rights, no privileges, unless the mob says so. You ever heard that phrase, mob mentality? Do you know why we have that phrase? Because it's a psychological truth that mobs are stupid and fickle. Fickle means they change their mind every minute. And when we call ourselves a democracy, that means we want to be ruled by stupid, fickle people. Do you know how I know we're not a democracy? If we were a democracy, Rosa Parks would still be at the back of the bus.
That's right.
Because in a democracy, minority groups never have a society-changing voice. They're always ruled by the mob. Only in a constitutional republic can a minority group have a society-changing voice. You want to be a democracy, you ever heard that saying, if you keep repeating a lie long enough, it becomes the truth? Go ahead and call us a democracy. It won't be long before we become one. Now, if you want a democracy, that's fine, go for it, but you better make sure you're always on the right side of the mob. Because democracies do not create liberty. Democracies create rulers and slaves. And these are the important things that we need to understand. Why we're not a democracy. It's not just a little difference, it's a big difference. Our liberty did not begin in 1776. Our liberty actually began in 1014. Because we're talking about British liberty charters and British history. In 1014, there was no England yet, and the people there were self-governed. They were called Anglo-Saxons. The Anglo-Saxons were sick and tired of being attacked by foreign governments. So they made a deal with a guy named Ethelred. And they told Ethelred, we will let you be king, but you have to let us govern ourselves. Your only job as king is to protect us from foreign invasion and to negotiate with foreign governments. All of the local government belongs to us, the people. We will govern ourselves. Your job is to keep us safe and to engage in foreign negotiations. And in February of 1014, Great Britain, or England, was formed. That's why it's called England. It's Anglo-land from Anglo-Saxons. Funny thing is they didn't understand what a republic was, and they created a kingdom. And the funny thing is, when you start looking for a king, don't be surprised when you find one who wants to act like one. Now the limitation here is very important, because there are different kinds of monarchies. There's pure monarchies, and then there's what Great Britain is. Great Britain is called a limited monarchy because the king could not do whatever he wanted. He's limited by the people because the people said, we'll let you be king, but we will govern ourselves. But something happened along the years. The people got comfortable being taken care of by the king. And they started giving more and more power to the king to take care of them. And the king is not going to turn that down. Are you kidding me? If somebody wants to give you power, are you going to turn it down? And the monarchy became less and less limited. We'll fast forward to 1045. The king's name is Edward the Confessor. Now at this time, we are now just 30 years from the original agreement with Ethelred, but we are light years from the original intent of the Anglo-Saxons. Now Edward the Confessor was considered a generous king. And he had given the people the rights and privileges closer to what they started off with. But Edward's about to die and he has no son. Now that's a big deal in a kingdom because there's no place to pass on the throne. But they don't go without remedy because if you live in a kingdom, there's always a list of people who are next to be king in case the king dies without having a son. Now the next person on this list to be king is a man named William. William. William knows he's supposed to be king. He even speaks to Edward about becoming king. The problem is the people of Great Britain do not want William to be king because William is not from Great Britain, he's from France. The British and the French, they don't get along so well. They don't want a foreign king. So they hatch out this plan to make this guy named Harold to be king of Great Britain. They're going to pick a king. They're going to elect a king. That doesn't happen. William gets wind that he's going to be denied the throne and it's going to be passed outside his bloodline, and he gets very, very upset. Now this is something that's very bad for the people of Great Britain because William has a nickname. He's called William the Conqueror. What do you suppose happens when you make a guy mad whose nickname is the Conqueror? He's going to conquer, right? William raises his Norman army. He goes over and defeats Harold and the English people and makes himself king. Now when you're king, or when you're ready to be king, you know you're about to get the greatest power of all. Only William, when he gets to Great Britain, finds out that Great Britain is not a pure monarchy, it's a limited monarchy, and he doesn't want to be limited. The limiting factor now is called common law. William hates common law. Now as king, he could literally step up and say, hey, I don't like common law anymore. I'm going to set aside this common law. We're not going to be common law people anymore. Wouldn't he have the power to do that as king? But let me ask you something. Since kings aren't elected, if you don't like your king, do you start a recall petition and hold a new election? Of course not. Do you find a new candidate to run against him in the next kingly election? No, when you don't like your king, what are your options? You got to chop off heads, right? Kings know this. Kings like keeping their heads. So William doesn't step up and declare common law gone. Instead, he decides he's going to fundamentally transform Great Britain. He starts replacing the judges in the common law system with judges who are not loyal to the common law, but loyal to the ideology and the beliefs of the king. He starts using those judges to enforce his foreign law on the people of Great Britain, even when it's contrary to their common law. He starts chasing the landowners off of their lands through threat and force of law. Literally running some of them completely out of the kingdom and then taking possession of their land and handing it over to his foreign friends. How else do you keep foreign law in a kingdom if it's not full of people who like that foreign law better than the common law? He starts replacing the leaderships in the churches with men who are not loyal to the Word of God, but loyal to the beliefs and the ideology of the king. So the king can use the churches to convince the people to do things even when it's contrary to the Word of God.
Come on.
This transformation spans over 40 years and 2 kings, William I and William II. William II is on the throne for just a short while, until one day William II and his little brother Henry I go hunting together. And William II is killed in a mysterious hunting accident when a stray arrow from his little brother's hunting party accidentally kills him, making his little brother king. Now, do you think this was an accident? No. Neither did the people of Great Britain. And Henry knew this, that when the people are unhappy with the king, kings lose their heads. So Henry has to do some things to make the people happy that he's on the throne. The first thing that he promises is, hey, you know what? I know this looks a little suspicious. I really didn't murder my brother to be king, but to prove that to you, we're going to do an investigation. We're going to investigate whether I'm at fault for the death of my brother or not. How do you suppose it's going to work out when the government is investigating itself? Henry's not at fault for the death of his brother. Henry's not, that's not working. The people aren't buying this investigation. So he makes another promise. He says, I will marry an Anglo-Saxon woman. Now at this time, the Anglo-Saxons are still the majority of the population. Now look at the brilliant thing that Henry and his advisors are doing. I'm going to marry an Anglo-Saxon woman to appease the majority of the people. Why? Because if you're Anglo-Saxon and you have an Anglo-Saxon queen, you have to believe the throne is going to send some good things your way. You're going to get extra benefits because the queen is going to take care of her people. And in the very least, if hard times fall on Great Britain, you won't suffer because there's no way the queen is going to let her people suffer. See, Henry and his advisors have figured out that the best way to appease the majority of the people is with promises of what they're going to get from the government. The last thing that Henry does is the most important thing. Henry signs the first document in what I call the genealogy of our Constitution. There are 5 documents that had to be written over 700 years before Thomas Jefferson could pen the Declaration. We could have a Constitution or the Bill of Rights. Every liberty that we have was initially created, or initially documented in these 5 documents. The first document is called the 1100 Charter of Liberties. In the 1100 Charter of Liberties, Henry makes the promise, kings will no longer be evil and oppressive. Ever again. And then makes a list of things that kings cannot do, because if they do them, they'll be evil and oppressive. Henry says, if any of my baron or earl shall die, now those are the landowners, if any of my baron or earl shall die, their heirs shall not be forced to purchase their inheritance, but shall retrieve it through force of law and custom. Henry said that if the heirs of an estate have to purchase their estate from the government before they can receive it, that's an evil and oppressive government. But wait a minute, isn't that what inheritance tax is? Death tax, have y'all heard of death tax? Ask your parents about that. A king in 1100 called that evil and oppressive, and our government calls it revenue. They're going to need this promise in 100 years because they're going to have the most evil king Great Britain will ever know. This king's name is John. John is a massive taxation king. And if you cannot pay your taxes in John's kingdom, you are fined some more. You are thrown into prison. You are mutilated. He's cutting off hands, feet, ears, cutting out tongues of people who cannot pay your taxes. And if you're lucky, you're simply executed. They called him ruthless and vicious. You guys know who John is, by the way. Ever heard of a guy named Robin Hood? That's the king in the Robin Hood story. Can I clear up a little lie that you've been taught your whole life about Robin Hood? What makes Robin Hood famous, right? Robbed from the rich and gave to the poor, right? Yeah, but that's a lie. Robin Hood was not robbing from the rich to give to the poor to redistribute wealth. Robin Hood was taking from the king and the crown the money that had been stolen from the people through oppressive and unlawful taxation, returning it to the people so they could live. Remember, John's going to murder you if you cannot pay your taxes. Robin Hood is not trying to put everybody on equal financial footing. He's giving everybody their lives back. Robin Hood is a liberty fighter, not a socialist, because the first step to liberty is always life. Because if you don't have a right to life, you don't have the right to liberty.
Right.
Promise in 1100 that kings no longer should be evil and oppressive. You obviously have no idea how to keep that promise. So now we, the people, are going to rise again in our majesty and tell the king what he can and cannot do. No taxation without representation. And then creates the representation that would become parliament. 25 men who will sit in the king's court with the power to tell the king, no, you can't do that because it violates our liberty. Our First Amendment comes from the Magna Carta. So do our 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th Amendments, all codified in 1215. We didn't invent them. 1625, we have a brand new king. His name is Charles I. Charles I is described as being a massive spending king. They say Charles likes to romp about Europe spending on his every whim and fancy. I don't know, did they have golf in 1625? Whose money was Charles spending? The people's money, how is he collecting it? Taxes. But taxation without representation is unlawful, and that representation is now called Parliament. Parliament gets sick and tired of Charles' wasteful spending and looks Charles dead in the eye and says, we're not passing any more of your laws until you get your spending under control. Charles says, fine. But let me remind you something, Parliament, I'm king. I don't need you. And he dissolves Parliament and violates the Magna Carta. Now he can't collect their money through taxes because he's violated the Magna Carta by dissolving Parliament. And kings know if you violate liberty too quickly, you lose your head. So Charles remembers that as king he has power of decree. It's a law-making power. The king can issue a decree independent of Parliament. Now he can't do that with a tax. It's got to come through Parliament. But he's going to collect the people's money through this decree, and he's not going to call it a tax. He's going to call it a forced loan. It's not a tax, it's a mandate. The people revolt against Charles. And we get the third document called the Petition of Right of 1628, a list of grievances against their king on how he's violated their liberty charters. Charles is allowed to remain king, but they're going to have to fight him again 20 years later. Because you see, now Charles is collecting their taxes with a very specific excuse. He's looking at the people, oh, no, I'm not women fancying anymore. I have a really good excuse. Do you see that over there? You see all those foreign wars going on over there? Do you want war to come to Great Britain? Do you want war to come to Great Britain? Of course you don't want war to come to Great Britain. But I have the perfect plan to keep those wars over there from coming to Great Britain. See, all you have to do is give me your tax dollars, and I will make sure that all our allies are funded in these foreign wars. And if our allies have proper funding and resources, they'll fight and win those wars over there, and war will never come to Great Britain. It's a matter of national security that you give me your tax dollars so I can fund our allies. But guess what? They figured out he's not funding their allies. He's funding their enemies, because their enemies have promised to help Charles get his people under subjection. Charles is brought up on charges of treason, found guilty, and sentenced to death. The fourth document, called the Grand Remonstrance of 1641. Now I have a minute and a half left, and I'm going to go a little bit long, so I hope you'll give me 3 country minutes. Got that? 3 country minutes. This Grand Remonstrance says, the root of all this mischief we find to be a malignant and pernicious design, subverting the fundamental laws and liberties of our kingdom. Do you know what that means in modern English? We've been watching tyrants for 600 years, and we're noticing a pattern. The same bag of tricks: corruption of the court system, infiltration of foreign law, diminishing property rights of the people, the government taking over the church, the creation of fiat money so the government can control the monetary system, and disarming the people while the government remained armed. I did not just describe you 2014. That was what they learned in 1641. 40 years later, they're fighting a new king, James II. The same malignant and pernicious design. This time we get the 5th document, called the English Bill of Rights of 1689. The late King James II, by the assistance of evil judges, counselors, and ministers employed by him, did endeavor to subvert and extirpate the laws and liberties of our kingdom. Extirpate. James is completely destroying liberty. Why? How? A whole list of grievances, but one of them, are you ready? James is writing law, overturning law, setting aside law when that was the sole duty of Parliament. You see, they had separation of powers in 1688. That was one of the questions on your test yesterday. Separation of powers ensures the preservation of liberty. It means that branches cannot share power, and they cannot steal power. And in 1688, when the executive branch was writing law, overturning law, and setting aside law, when that was a duty reserved to the legislative branch alone, They went to war and said the executive branch was completely destroying their liberty. And in 1688, they thought that important. Today, our Congress does nothing about executive orders. 70 years later, brand new king. You guys know him? His name is George III. Because we didn't go to war over taxes. We went to war over the malignant and pernicious design. George III in Parliament passing laws without representation in the colonies, mandating purchases, criminalizing people who refuse to purchase the government monopolies, throwing them in prison, denying them their due process, and then transporting them to Quebec to be tried in foreign courts. It was not taxes, it was tyranny. And the Declaration of Independence was not a brand new document, but another list of grievances, just like the Magna Carta, the Petition of Right, the Grand Remonstrance, and the English Bill of Rights. Jefferson did not invent the Declaration of Independence. He took bits and pieces from those 5 documents before. We did not invent liberty, we inherited it. Liberty must be supported at all hazards. We have a right to it derived from our Maker. But if we had not, our fathers have bought and purchased it for us with their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. Liberty is not a gift that you purchase for yourself. We've done nothing to earn the right to sit here today. That was given by everyone who came before us. Liberty is a gift you have to pay forward. And if you don't know what your liberty is, it's gone. Thank you for your time.